Hello. I'm going to once again forego the series of readings from the Julius Bronthal book, History of the International. I'll most likely return to that series on Wednesday when I stream on Wednesday. I wanted to take the opportunity today to sort of condense and to some extent build upon what I was discussing in my previous video last Wednesday. That video was titled Karl Marx and Socialism, and it ended up being quite a long video. It was around 2 hours, and I had initially intended it to be a lot shorter than that, and I guess my sort of rumination got away from me. So I wanted to try to restate the point that I was trying to get at, and that I eventually arrived at towards the end of that video. But I wanted to do so in a more concise way, and I also wanted to do so in the context of the difference between socialism and progressivism, because I think this is a very typical conflation these days, where socialism and progressivism are treated as essentially synonymous, or at least as sort of degrees on a spectrum. Maybe socialism is a somewhat more radical version of the same thing that progressivism represents. But before I get to that point, I wanted to return to that previous video and what I see, at least, as Karl Marx's fundamental contribution to socialism, to the history of socialism, socialism as both a movement and an idea, or as a series of related ideas. When socialism first emerged, it referred specifically to the ideas of Robert Owen, although other thinkers would be grouped in as well. Saint-Simon, Fourier, and others as well. But what the term referred to with respect to Owen, and I will cover Owen in more detail in future videos, but to summarize, what Owen was getting at with his ideas, and he didn't use the term socialism himself, it was a term that was used to refer to him and his followers, but he sort of he didn't like the term, and he sort of tried to distance himself from it. He actually used, I think he himself took up the term as a way of referring to sort of followers of his or like-minded people who he thought were not quite getting what he was talking about, who were sort of on the right track, but they were missing sort of the key point he was trying to make. But leaving that aside for the moment, if we'll accept the term socialism to describe Owen's idea was for a rational system of society. And what he meant by that was essentially refounding society in its entirety, by transforming the relations that through which society is organized in a rational manner. He saw all preceding history as being characterized by social forms that were not rationally devised, but that had a kind of accrued over time, accumulated, and just sort of piled up incidentally in the course of history. And over the course of that history, of course, there was quite a lot of good, but also quite a lot of bad that had sort of accumulated. And so Owen's essential idea was, we are now at a point where we can reflect rationally on the development of society and history. And because of that, we are now at a point where we can reshape society on a completely rational basis. Now, those ideas of Owen's weren't really new exactly. He didn't exactly crib them from anyone either. He was sort of he was an original thinker. He did have influences, but he was an original thinker, not so much in the sense that he came up with this really dramatically new idea or new way of thinking, so much as that he rediscovered something. He rediscovered a way of thinking that was sort of in crisis or coming into crisis in his moment, which was the Industrial Revolution. Owen himself, if you don't know, was a factory owner in Industrial Revolution era Manchester, and one of the most successful factory owners at that. And his sort of amateur sociological speculations and reflections were occurring in the course of his experience as, a factory owner, someone who was managing a workforce and who was a man of influence and wealth in the seat of this hotbed of social transformation, and not just transformation in the sense of new things emerging, but also in the sense of old ways of life, old forms of social life were being destroyed, and the destruction was just sort of piling up in the streets of Manchester, quite literally, in the form of, waste byproducts of the process of industry, but also the wasted lives of proletarianized workers who were unable to find employment. So, Owen's ideas of refounding society on a rational basis weren't exactly new, but they were sort of new to him in the sense that he wasn't exactly the most well-versed. He didn't dedicate his life to studying philosophy. He had certainly read some Enlightenment era philosophy and so on, but he saw his insights as really new. They weren't really that new. What was new was the context, and the context in which he was trying to apply these ideas. So what it would mean to refound society on a rational basis in the 1810s, 1820s, in the Industrial Revolution era, England and Manchester, it meant something different than it would have meant, for example, in the 18th century, or even as recently as during the French Revolution, which was only, in a sense, was still ongoing at the time, but in another sense had only just sort of come to an end as Owen was beginning to develop these insights. And France, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, if you're not familiar with the history, was not as economically advanced, not as industrially developed as England was at the same time. And it was only with the kind of conclusion of the French Revolution and the restoration of the monarchy that sort of starts to turn around. And even more so, it's later into the 19th century with the Second Empire of Louis Bonaparte that it really sort of fully takes effect. The Industrial Revolution the impact of it is fully felt in France. So Owen's sense was that there was an opportunity as well as a problem emerging from the Industrial Revolution. And the way he dealt with that was that there was, in his mind, both a necessity and a possibility for transforming social relations as a whole, because this transformative process that was unfolding with the emergence of large-scale industry was undermining the old ways of life, and new things were emerging. But for Owen, these new things that were emerging were not satisfactory, and hence they were leading to all sorts of problems, unemployment and the associated social ills being kind of paramount among those, and that those were generally kind of referred to at the time by the phrase the social question or the social problem. And for Owen, the solution to the social problem was also, in a sense, the cause. Namely, this transformative process had to be rationally guided. And so for him, the question was who was to do the guiding. And it was, a rather obvious it was a rather obvious answer for someone like Owen and someone in his position, a man of wealth and influence and power in this era and in this place. It was men like him. It was men like him who were to guide this rational transformation of society. And he sought to do that himself in whatever ways he was able. In the course of his career as a social reformer, someone who is trying to see through this transformation of society, he had a lot of different approaches, and I'll go into those in more detail in the future. I don't want to get too sidetracked by this. And there were times where he made appeals to the existing governmental powers to take up his ideas, but he didn't ultimately trust the political process the political situation of the time. He didn't trust it to sort of simply by the merit of his arguments alone find these reforms to be the necessary course to take. He also, for a time, was interested in the role of the workers themselves in helping get his ideas realized. Although he would ultimately sort of back away from that prospect as well. His interest in the workers, in the working class, wasn't simply, it wasn't something he kind of came up with. In fact, he was sort of resistant to the idea, but it was the fact that workers were taking up his ideas independently, simply by their own interest in the speeches and publications associated with Owen's philosophy, that he ended up looking to them as a potential instrument to realize his ideas. Now, Hal Draper, in his account of the history of socialism and Marx's role within it, which is influential on my own understanding. I do think there are some limitations to it, but I do think it's generally rather good and among the best accounts that you can find, as long as you're able to, take it with a grain of salt, as it were, and see Draper in the context in which he was writing, and see the emphases he puts on various things for what they are and what motivated them. But in Draper's account, Marx was the first socialist to break with a way of thinking that characterized all previous socialist intellectuals, socialist ideologues, if you will, but also that characterized essentially all thinking about social life and politics and social change in previous history up to that point. maybe with occasional exceptions. But Draper saw all previous socialists before Marx, and essentially all other socialists that weren't Marxists, and even many who would call themselves Marxists later, as sharing in common with all previous ways of thinking about society, ways of thinking that were characteristic of the ruling classes in all previous forms of society and the intellectual expositors of the ruling ideas of previous forms of society. Draper saw all of them as characterized by essentially the idea that the ideas of the ruling class are, or let me rephrase that. Essentially, that ideas come to society, to the masses of people that constitute society, and they come from above, is in Draper's favored kind of metaphor. There are these bright people that have these great ideas, and then the masses of people in society are motivated by, moved by those ideas. But they are not, it's not essential that they themselves kind of understand the ideas and take them up for themselves. It's more a matter of the masses functioning as a kind of instrument for the people that have the ideas. And in Owen's conception, for example, he had this vision of a rational reorganization of society. And for him, the question was, how was this to be executed? What was the instrument that would be used to realize this transformation of society? And while he was himself sort of wary of using the working class as that instrument, for at least for most of his career, there was nonetheless this question of how to get masses of people supporting this idea such that it could be brought to fruition. So Marx differs from Owen and from all the other socialists that preceded him in Draper's view, in that Marx saw the working class taking up the ideas of the socialists, not as simply the potential for an instrument. He didn't see in this the potential of the workers serving as an instrument for the realization of these ideas. Rather, he saw the workers taking up these ideas as indicative of their own kind of intellectual maturation as they dealt with the process of change in society that they were, in a sense, the kind of ultimate symptom of. The condition of the working class in the Industrial Revolution was sort of the symptom of this change that was going on. It was the indication that a change was occurring, but without, in a sense, a clear resolution. So the change was being experienced as a problem rather than as simply, something that was destined to lead to some new state of affairs. Marx saw the working class in taking up the ideas of these socialist intellectuals not simply as doing what the socialists thought was right. He saw them as trying to make sense of the situation that they were caught up in. And that was, in a sense, the significance of the socialist ideas. For Marx, it wasn't that these ideas were right. It was that they were the means by which the workers were clarifying their own situation for themselves. Now, that was the intellectual side of the clarification, as it were. But the workers weren't simply trying to figure something out in abstraction. They were caught up in this process of social change, and they were actively involved in the change as it was occurring. In Owen's, Owen and Marx overlapped time-wise, but Owen's career was sort of coming to an end as Marx's was beginning. And in Owen's younger days, the 1810s, 1820s, the industrial working class was not really as active an element. It was more kind of caught up in this process of change, that it was being swept up in a process of change that it was more or less passively involved with. But over the subsequent decades, and in the course of, among other things, engaging with the ideas of people like Owen, the industrial working class in England and France and Belgium but especially in England, was becoming more and more actively involved in efforts to mitigate, and to whatever extent they could, to master the process of change that they were suffering from. So the formation of trade unions, the formation of cooperatives, these were, for example, practical forms in which workers were trying to do something about this change rather than simply suffer from it. Another, and perhaps the most important form in which the workers were trying to do something about this change, was in the political struggle for democracy. And this would ultimately take the form of Chartism. Chartism was a movement for democratic reform that was originally a kind of cross-class phenomenon. It involved middle class as well as working class people. But as it progressed, the conflict between these groups grew, and ultimately there was a kind of fundamental schism between the working class Chartists and the middle class Chartists. And again, this is another topic that I will, go into greater detail in the future about. So I don't want to, try to cover this entire history here. I can't really do that off the top of my head in a satisfactory way. But there was this, and especially for Marx, there was this really central significance of the role of the working class in the struggle for democratic reform and for democratic revolution, for that matter. In the case of in the case of France, for example, where the monarchy had been restored after the collapse of the revolution. So just as so previous socialists, Owen, for example, and he's kind of my key example here, but you could say the same of other thinkers as well. While he did at times look to the working class as a potential instrument for realizing his ideas, and while he did look to the political system of the time, for at least at times, as a potential instrument for realizing his ideas, he never really had kind of a consistent faith in either of those potential instruments. And it was in the course of his efforts and the frustrations of those efforts that he would kind of lose faith in both of those instruments eventually. But one thing that Owen certainly never saw as a kind of viable road for the realization of socialism, of a rational reorganization of society as a whole, was the political initiative of the working class itself. This, for Draper, was, in a sense, Marx's fundamental insight that distinguished him from other socialists, that it wasn't through the trade unions or cooperatives or other sorts of experimental forms of social organization and social action that the workers were going to overcome the crisis that was facing them in the form of proletarianization, in the form of the predicament of labor in the Industrial Revolution, in industrial society. It wasn't any of these things that were going to lead to socialism in that sense, in the sense of a rational reorganization of society from the standpoint of the workers. For Marx, and this is certainly in Draper's account, although I think it's basically true. Pardon me. For Marx, it was the fact that the working class was beginning to form itself into a political force, seeking to take political power into its own hands, that there was a potential for social transformation. And the other forms of organization, forms of social action, like economic organization, trade unions, cooperatives, other things along these lines, educational organizations, it's not that these didn't have a role to play. They did for Marx. But the point would be that the prospect of political transformation, of political action, of the transformation of society, not in its particulars, not through particular forms of organization within society, but the reorganization of society in its totality in a deliberate way, which would be the kind of the political prospect. That's what politics represents in contrast to other kinds of social action. It was in this prospect of the working class transforming society as a whole politically, that socialism had its real significance as a means of making sense of the necessary change, the necessary reorganization of society that the Industrial Revolution put to the workers. So this is really, I think, the key insight for Marx. This is, I think, what distinguishes Marx, and this is, I'm following Draper in this. That it is that ultimately what socialism represents is not this or that system of reorganizing society. It's the prospect of the working class taking up the political task of reorganizing society for itself. And this occurs in the course of its engagement in the struggle for democratic reform and democratic revolution, as it comes to realize that in that struggle, while it may share common ends with the middle class up to a point, there is a point at which the reasons these different classes are struggling for democratic reforms diverge. And ultimately, the reasons why the middle class wants democratic reforms are incompatible with the reasons the workers are seeking democratic reforms. The workers are seeking democratic reforms as a means of overcoming the situation in which industrialization is placing them. And that may be through social reforms, things like limitations on the working day, or legislation to, improve the conditions of labor in the factories, things like that. It may be more ambitious and more. It may include more ambitious kind of moves as well. But there is this sort of idea that in the process of implementing even these sort of more basic reforms, you would ultimately have to undertake more and more radical measures, because the implications of those basic reforms would be the need to reorganize society in a broader way to address the problems that led to the need for those more fundamental reforms in the first place. So I'm now at around half an hour, and I don't feel like I've been as concise as I wanted to be. So let me just bring it back to the point I was trying to make in the title of the video, namely that there is a distinction to be drawn between socialism and progressivism. Socialism, at least for Marx, what distinguishes socialism for Marx, the significance of socialism as the intellectual expression of the working class movement, is that socialism represents the goal of the working class that makes the seizure of political power, the conquest of political power by the working class necessary. Socialism ultimately comes to symbolize the horizon of possible change that industrialization opens up, but that can only be pursued through the rule of the working class. And the reason for that is because industrialization represents a contradiction at the heart of a society based on labor as the source of property, labor as the fundamental social relation, bourgeois society, in other words. Industrialization, on the one hand, is, in a sense, the ultimate expression of a society of labor, but it's also the negation of a society of labor. Industrialization is, in a sense, the perfection of the labor process, but at the same time, it's the rendering obsolete of labor in that process. So at one and the same time, the powers of labor are perfected, but the role of the laborers themselves is undermined, so that you increasingly no longer need labor to accomplish the very ends that labor is, in a sense, pursuing, that the society of laborers is pursuing. So the workers, in participating in this process, are, in a sense, undermining their own role within it. They're rendering themselves obsolete. They're rendering their function within society obsolete. And yet they still depend on the sale of their labor to live. So this leads to chronic and mass unemployment, which hangs over the workers who are employed as a constant threat. This whole topic requires a lot more detailed exposition to do it justice, but at the heart of capitalism is this self-contradiction of labor. That's what capital is. It's labor rendering itself obsolete. That's what it means to say that dead labor holds living labor in its grasp. It's the product of labor that is, in a sense, terrorizing the workers themselves. It's what they make, what they are making. And the point there is that it's the workers themselves that have to take responsibility for this process. They must take charge. They must oversee the abolition of their own role in society as laborers. Because if they don't, all that's going to happen is the same problem is going to keep getting reproduced in more and more daunting and more and more kind of expanded and difficult to overcome forms. So it's the workers that have to take responsibility for this process, this self-contradictory process that industrialization is. And that's why they have to take political power. They have to oversee this process as a whole. And so that, for Marx, was what socialism ultimately represented. It wasn't this or that vision of social reorganization. It wasn't this or that notion of a system of society. It was it was precisely the prospect of the working class organizing itself into a political force and taking power. So Draper summarizes Marx's insight in what he calls the principle of the self-emancipation of the working class, which he sees in Marx's phrase from the rules of the First International: the emancipation of the workers must be conquered by the workers themselves. That principle is further elaborated and expanded upon in the notion that the workers had to form their own political party. And by political party, what was meant was not simply like an electoral vehicle or something like that, although it could serve as that in certain situations. What was meant by political party was ultimately that the workers had to organize themselves to take power, and to transform society in a revolutionary manner by taking power. And to whatever extent that could be pursued through electoral means, it should be, but it was by no means to limit itself to whatever the legal forms of representation, political representation were at the time, because of course the whole point was to not simply abide within the existing forms of political and social life, but to transform them, to further transform them. So the workers had to form themselves into a political party. In other words, they had to organize themselves to take power and to do so in a revolutionary manner. And ultimately, the goal being to conquer political power. So the workers had to not only form a political party, but they had to, through doing so, actually establish their rule over society, and society at a global scale, for that matter. And that's what was meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. The working class on a global scale, and above all that meant in the advanced capitalist countries, had to organize themselves in such a manner that they could take political control over the core political, the core seats of capitalist industry, and use that political power to transform the capitalist production process on a global scale in the interests of the workers themselves, which ultimately meant overseeing the abolition of labor in a manner that was to the benefit of the workers and to all of humanity for that reason. So that differs from what most people mean by socialism today, I think, in a sort of pronounced way. And generally what I think people mean by socialism is sort of convertible with what they mean by progressivism, which is essentially that the state should intervene in society and in the economy in particular in manners that are beneficial to the workers and to other oppressed people. That totally leaves open the question of who controls the state power and to what end they are implementing these reforms. The sine qua non of socialism from a Marxist perspective would be the working class seeking to emancipate itself by means of its own independent activity, independent social and economic activity, but above all political activity. And that means above all political organization into a political party as a class, and doing so for the sake of conquering political power independently as a class, pursuing its own independent aims, its own independent goals as a class, goals that it fundamentally does not share with any other elements of society, goals that the middle class, the middle class or the capitalist class would not pursue. Okay, so I see my friend Danny Jacobs has been posting a number of quotations in the chat, and maybe I think I should have been looking at that in the course of what I was saying, because it probably would have helped me clarify what I was trying to say. I guess I'll just conclude by reading a little fragment that I jotted down this morning. All progress in capitalism is ambivalent, self-contradictory, simultaneously progress and regress. So the point being that it's not that there is no progress under capitalism, but that the progress, whatever progress you could point to, from whatever standpoint you're regarding it as progress, it's inevitably tainted by its opposite, by regression. Not only in the sense that progress in one regard is accompanied by regress in some other regard, but even kind of unambiguous steps forward, if you will, from the standpoint of the existing society, anything that you could see as improving society as it is, ultimately entrenches the existing social relations. Now, the point isn't to reject that. The point isn't to reject things that entrench existing social relations. But the question is, what is the ultimate historical destiny of the society we live in? Is it simply going to perpetuate itself forever? Or is there a necessary change that must be brought about? And if the latter, then the question is, how can whatever is unfolding within society as it is serve as a means to realizing that change? So, for example, winning legislation for the limitation of the working day could be seen as progress from the standpoint of the workers. Certainly, working class people might see that as progress, that their condition in society is improving. There were socialists who saw such a move as regressive. Proudhon, for example, saw any kind of intervention by the state that interferes with the rights of private individuals to contract with others and set the terms of their labor. He saw that as incursions upon the freedom of individuals by the state, and as obstructive to their efforts to emancipate themselves. So, of course, the same thing could be seen as progress or regress, depending on how you're looking at it. But from Marx's point of view, the question would be, how can such a move serve the historical task of the working class in its effort to in its destiny of taking political power and thereby transforming society as a whole? That's how Marx would look at something like that. So the question isn't simply, is it good or is it bad? But is it serving the efforts of the working class to organize itself into a political force and to become conscious of the necessity of that task? So progress is ambivalent, self-contradictory, simultaneously progress and regress. Progressivism denies the contradiction, imagining straightforward progress is possible. True progress would only be possible on the basis of the political rule of the working class, using that power to overcome capitalism. Progressivism is not a step in that direction. It is a distraction that misleads or confuses, and thereby obstructs the possibility of movement toward the necessary goal. So, progressivism, in the way I'm looking at it here, is essentially this view that that there is a simple, straightforward way of improving society as it exists. Whereas the real point would be that any change in society would be, obviously potentially good and bad from different standpoints. but also from the standpoint of socialism, from the standpoint of the necessity of the working class taking political power to thereby transform society consciously. That any such change is both good and bad at the same time. It both reinforces the existing social relations, but also potentially, at least, could serve or could help serve the working class developing its consciousness and organization. But then the question is whether or not it is doing so. And at present, there is really no consciousness, let alone organization in a more substantial sense, as if you could separate the two. You really can't. But there's really no consciousness of the necessity of the working class organizing itself into a political force that would take political power. And to the extent that people talk about socialism today, the vast majority of them simply mean what simply are pursuing what is meant by progressivism in that sense. They might be a little more apparently radical in the extent of what changes they see as necessary or how rapidly they see those changes as potentially being implemented. But socialism in the Marxist sense did not mean the state intervening to improve the conditions of the working class. It meant the working class taking power, taking control of the state themselves, organizing to take control of the state themselves, and to thereby take responsibility for the unfolding transformation of society. Okay. Maybe that was somewhat of an improvement or clarification over the last video. But I think I'll probably return to the readings for the next few videos at least. I don't know. Let me know if you benefited from this, if you thought this was interesting. I'm still trying to work through my own goals with this project. And, as much as I would like to, make this a venue for me to work out my own thoughts, I don't necessarily know how much good that does for others. So, if you enjoyed this, let me know. If you had questions or thought anything you took issue with anything I said or wanted to further discuss it, please let me know. And I'll be back on Wednesday with the next video, most likely returning to the Bronthal History of the International. And thanks for joining me today. I'll see you Wednesday.